till 9:15. Well, you go to bed early, don't you, in Pembrokeshire? Anyway, anyone here from Cardigan? Sure? From Cardigan? Oh, okay. Well, I'll come back to you in a minute. This is Brian Manton, but before I hand over to Brian, I just thought I'd explain these things, in case you don't know what they are. These were designed by someone called Melissa, who turned up at Theatre Gwaun for some rehearsals for the piece we did on Friday night. And then she came up to me and said, would you like to see the whale? So behind this, there's a big paper whale made with willow wands. But these things are actually in the show, because we're talking about stories this evening. This is an actual story that Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, wrote about a big storm in Newgale. You probably heard it. Some of you maybe you were around when it happened. Anyway, it was such a mighty storm that the wind and the buffeting waves threw fish so that they landed on the blackthorn hedges, and they were picked off the blackthorn hedges. So that explains that. I was thinking that with Brian's stories, because Brian's story is about somewhere similar to where Brian grew up, which is not dissimilar to Fishguard. I wanted to sort of share with you sort of just one little oddity of life. Sian Phillips, great actress, isn't she? Sian Phillips. So Sian Phillips appeared on a TV programme I was working on in 1986. And she turned up and she recited a poem. And she said, I love this poem so much, I've decided to commit it to memory. Then a few years ago, about 3-4 years ago, she appeared in a National Theatre Wales production in the Patty Pavilion in Swansea, and she was brilliant, because Sian Phillips is always brilliant. And my mate Gerald and I had gone along to the Patty Pavilion and stopped off in Tesco on the way there and got the cheap, this day sandwiches and some cans of Ruddles, and we were planning to do the poor man's Glyndebourne. So we were going to go to the thing, enjoy Sian Phillips, then sit in the park outside the Patty Pavilion, and as we were sitting there, opening the cans, Sian Phillips came out and walked towards us. And it's Sian Phillips, diva, one of the best actresses in the history of Welsh acting. And she came up to us, and I said, that coup de théâtre at the end of the show tonight was marvellous. You were magnificent, Miss Phillips. And she said, thank you. But then she didn't move on. I was thinking, oh God, what do I do now? Because I didn't like the rest of the show. So I said, in the mid-80s, you appeared on a chat show on BBC Wales TV, and you recited this poem about the Icelandic language, which you loved so much that you committed it to memory. And she said, yes. I said, I thought it was a great poem. So I've learnt it too. I learnt it that night, really. And she's looking at me like I'm the weirdest stalker she's ever had. So the poem goes like this. It's about the Icelandic language, but it could be about the Welsh language, apart from the fact there's a line in it which refers to the middle class. And when you hear it, you'll see that it's maybe true about Icelandic, but not about the Welsh language. This language is so old that you cannot recognise the Industrial Revolution in it. It is the language of sheep and fish, horses and running water. The flush toilet has not even been invented in this language. You still stumble through the darkness and the rain with an old newspaper. The door creaks open and a stale human smell comes up out of the earth. This language still believes in ghosts, horses whinnying in a moonlit gully where there are no horses, cold marbly hands passing over your forehead as you sleep in an air-conditioned room. Old ladies can wind their long hair in this language and can hum and knit and make pancakes, but you cannot have a cocktail party in this language, for it is too heavy. You must sit down to speak it, for once you have begun, the whole course of your life is laid out before you, every foolish mistake made clear. So move around the language, delight in it. Move around from case to case, gender to gender, the vowels hardening, the consonants softening, till they are the sound of a gull's wings, fluttering as it flies after the wake of a small boat drifting out to open water. So at this point now, Sian Phillips is really worried. She's looking at me like I'm the sort of psychotic one. But bear in mind that she's joined me in it. She's recited it with me, and Gerald is there with his kind of riddles. And it was a very, very weird moment. Anyway, this is a preamble. Brian Manton, who lives in Swansea, and he's come on the very deluxe Transport for Wales train, all the way from Swansea to Goodwick, to introduce us to the inhabitants of a strange village. It's not like Fishguard. It's not as weird as Fishguard, because I've only been here now since, what was it, last night, and the number of stories I could tell you about the odd things that have happened, you know they're true, because Fishguard is on the edge of things. It's in another multiverse. So Brian is going to take you to his odd place. So please welcome Brian Manton.
Thank you for coming out, and thanks John for a nice introduction. I'm going to jump straight in. John has set it up nicely, so welcome to Kilphouca. Hide away in the folded midlands of Erin sits belligerently the small community of Kilphouca. Nary a river nor lake would come near it, and with good reason too, the locals often said. A mean-spirited land, in need of mothering, and blessed, therefore, by the presence of the good-natured people who had always lived there and tucked it in each night. That one man could forever change the nature of the town, would put forevermore a murmur in its soft heartbeat, was never expected. But that faithful year, during the Bealtaine celebrations, at the feast of our own St. Phineas, when something got into the water of life, the Uisce Beatha, Martin Fennessy's special brew whiskey, and the whole of the town enjoying it, let me tell you lads, queer things were seen. A strangeness came upon the town of Kilphouca that lasted not an unsubstantial number of days. Visions and voices, fugues and compulsions. Most everyone had a sup, and most everyone was in some way gondoliered through their own private phantasmagoria. I myself am forever afflicted by that demon drop, and am bestowed ever since with the onus of seeing behind every pair of Kilphoucan eyes the turgid memory of that night, and it playing on them, altering the course of their fate down strange meanders. It's not spoken of. It hangs in the minds of neighbours, nodding to each other on the way to Mass of a Sunday morning, a tacit agreement that it's all best locked away. But I was there, and I can tell that you're the discreet sort, sure. What's the harm in telling me a few tales, and I know it'll go no further, right? As I mentioned, it all started with Martin Fennessy. Not the cliched mountain man with the bathtub distillery, no, that was his father. Martin was a respectable accountant, the only one in Kilphouca at that, the accountant to every soul in the town who might be in need of one, and a few who probably weren't. Martin wore the same old tweed suit day in, day out. It was an old style of a cut, and had been his uncle's, who was, as it happens, the first accountant that Kilphouca ever bore. That old suit had seen the intimate financial vagaries of every small-time philanthropist and big-time miscreant ever to grace or disgrace the town. And below Martin's tweed slacks, on his long feet, lived invariably a brazen pair of blue Yankee Converse trainers. An ideator was Martin, a sums and figures man who never cared a lick about coin or paper money. He was obsessed with usefulness. Making things for others was his delight. A fixer, a tinker, not in the old sense of the word, though the local travelling community loved him also, and he made for them interesting contraptions. Dynamos to light the under-chassis neons of their clamorous, dead-of-night street racing traps. Martin had worked out how many wheel rotations there would be for this street or that one, and had composed a sequence of the lambent colours that would switch up on the major turns of the Speed Demon route. Distilling, similarly, was a numbers game to Martin. All the volumes, ratios and timings were just more elegant arithmetic that traced invisibly before his eyes. Picture him now, Martin, lost in cipher, and it giving every bit of him that old calm that he loved, that cool breath of order. The whiskey was made in gift to the town. Martin wasn't a drinker himself, mind. The stuff had done in the liver of his father before him, and then the liver of his uncle, opening up, of course, the position of town accountant. A bittersweet promotion for Martin. Fine funeral for the uncle, solid wake altogether, saw him off well. But a maudlin feckin' office inherited. Everything coated in the must of the dead, and the air still built of the long departed's coughs and wheezes. Anyway, the whisky. After all the visions had subsided, many folk started to wonder if Martin had some secret vendetta against the townspeople, to wonder if he had indeed done something sinister and found some sheltered bluff with a view to watch the chaos unfold from on high. Those who really knew him never doubted his measure, but the whispers remain to this day. A bad element should not survive in whisky, but the whisky was the only common factor that people could settle on. What caused it for certain, we can't know. Martin wrote a hefty research document, complete with literature review and statistical analysis, which he self-published using the photocopier in the post office. Nicely bound it was too, using a saddle stitch method that Lucy Maher, a sixth year in the secondary school, had taught to him. Martin even had a fella down from Trinity College Dublin, taking water samples and talking all sorts. Ergot poisoning, St. John's dance, St. Anthony's fire, some mania causing fungus, his reckoning. Our symptoms here different to other instances of such contamination, less pain and spasms, more mad shite, blackguarding and tomfoolery, and tinged, a lot of it, with hints of the old world. A unique phenomenon on our town's own private and ancient festival, the aberrations of St. Phineas. Those of us with minds inclined to listen to the old stories can't help but wonder. And sure, Jesus lads, this is Kilphouca we're talking about. Aren't we all that way inclined? So that's our introduction to Kilphouca. The first story in this collection is Human Shapes. And similar to the last show, for those of you who saw it, it's another fairy tale, so set on the ferry from Fishguard to Rosslare. Maeve Tierney barged into the luggage hold as the attendant unlocked the door. She went to her red suitcase and removed a small glass bottle from the ball of t-shirts wadded around it. She told the attendant she had left her heart medicine in her bag, and now saw his eyes narrow at the clutched naggin. Your heart medicine? You've no idea about it. Maeve felt the sea knuckle the ferry as it left the bay, off home to Ireland. She took a seat in the aisle across from the gift shop, next to one of those over-prepped sleepers with duvet and pillow and entitled snore. She lifted the brown tag that hung from the neck of the bottle. A taste of home, festival night only. A quick look out the window behind her showed the last of the daylight, scraping its everyday apocalypse down to the horizon line. Festival night in Kilphouca. You're the boss, Dad. Maeve unscrewed the metal cap and took a swig. Harsh, unwelcome, just right. Her mother had always counselled that the drink was not to be turned to in hard times or crises. Don't take on any crutches, there's enough you can't cast away. Maeve put this down to her mother, being the daughter and wife of a publican, and having the knowledge of every shade of drinker. But Maeve hated to take any advice from her mother, on drink or any matter. Maeve always felt apart from her family, her parents always stumbling around for some lost etiquette that would allow them to interact with her. Maeve was in crisis now. A short whore of a text message, carefully timed to deliver after her departure. No getting off the boat now. The sender's phone off. No questions would be answered, on maritime call rate or otherwise. Slapped with this for a 3.5-hour sailing, to chew on it alone. I can't. I'll contend with this vile burn in my throat instead. The people passing, gaggles of fellas, pretty English rugby boys, gangly and roguish Irish hurling lads, louts, backpackers, the big yawners, grannies in and out of the gift shop, some trade in Toblerones. Families stalled in the aisles, asking each other stupid questions none of them cared about. The sleepwalking staff. All these human shapes and their movements, the clatter of them, endless. Only solution, thought Maeve. Stop recognizing the shapes. Let them fade away. Just waves crashing past me, above me. I'm underwater. She held a swig in her mouth until it hurt. Maeve went out on deck with the empty shapes of the smokers and the power walkers. She was bleary now. The sky was giving up on the day and the waves were in her ears. The stretch of water out there often put her in the mind of possibility. Little futures could play out in your head. Going home, though, brought on the opposite effect. A drawing in, a regression. Back to play acting. Real life was in Wales now. Was in Wales. Then that whore of a text message and a phone turned off like a slammed door. Maeve's feet went from under her. No magic in the salt air to right her. She got up from the wet deck and moved on, edging down the metal stairs, 2 hands on the thin rail, the naggin clinking. Her jacket had slipped from her shoulders, only a light top on her beneath, bare skin contracting. She wanted the cold, let it eat away at her from the outside, let the whiskey burn from the gut. She noticed a gull to her side, close, but out over the water. The ship lights stenciled it white over the black waves, hard to focus on. The gull kept pace with her, gliding as she stumbled along the deck. We're too far out for gulls. Her legs were gone bandy again, and she wavered along the deck toward the front of the ferry. Do you want something, you anemic crow? A soft and immersive mist was coming down on her now, soaking her. It was quiet but for the roar of the sea, and she was alone but for the insistency of the gull. As she crossed the main deck, the gull soared and came down to glide next to her again as she walked back along the other side of the ship. There were sounds ahead of her as she approached the stern, sounds breaking out from the crash of the waves. A screeching rabble. Gulls. Her companion swooped ahead, screeched out, announcing her. She climbed the stairs to the helipad deck and saw hundreds of gulls, gliding, wheeling, hanging, tearing at each other. None landed on the deck or railing. They curtained the deck, filling the air, but leaving the black and featureless sky above open and raining down. The ship heaved upward and threw Maeve to her knees, prostrated in front of the angry circus of birds. Some of the gulls formed clusters, here and there. The light from the ship moved across them as it pitched in the swell. Maeve saw that the gulls in these clusters carried lines of catgut in their beaks, taut lines stretching down into the water. The other gulls moved clear of one of the clusters as it broke into a frantic bustle of wing beats. The birds moved upward, slowly, and hove a figure from the sea, a human shape. A woman in a long, waterlogged dress. The gulls lowered her, so her feet dragged on the deck, her body hanging near lifeless on the catgut wires bound tight around limbs and torso and tangling above her as the birds fought. It was Maeve's mother. Her head was raised, looking at Maeve, and it smiled, water pouring from the mouth. More bodies were dredged up from the sea by the cackling gulls. Bodies hung from wires all across the deck. Her father, all her aunts, school friends and teachers, old drunks from the bar, all smiling wet smiles and dragging their sodden feet. The untethered gulls started to swoop at Maeve, to scratch and bite at her. She crawled to the stairs and dragged herself down. On the lower deck she hung over the rail and vomited. A bit of clarity, not real. Phantom gulls pecked away. She felt nothing but the bite of the cold. A hand on her arm. Come inside, hon, you'll catch your death. Maeve allowed the woman to lead her through the heavy doors. Hot light and stale air. Maeve lowered herself to the floor and sobbed. The woman sat next to her. Maeve took out her phone and unlocked it on the screen with the text message, handed it to the woman. Oh, love, you're pregnant? The woman asked. Not me. My little Welsh carriad. Thoughts of Nerys washed over her. The promise that Nerys would come to Kilphouca with her, meet her parents, let Maeve be herself there in her hometown for the first time. Sailing home alone now, to face all those dredged up souls. She'll hold her breath and stay beneath the waves.
That is such beautiful writing. I said about Cardiganshire, my favourite Cardiganshire story concerns the man who's living in London and he has to come home for his brother's funeral. And of course, Cardiganshire people, as is unfairly alleged, are a bit mean. So they've turned up this free gig this evening. Sorry, he arrives home and he phones up the local newspaper, the Tideside Advertiser, and he says, I'd like to put a notice of death in your newspaper. And the woman at the other end in the advertising section of the paper says, certainly, sir. What would you like to write? He says, write, Lewis is dead. And she says, certainly, sir. It's £1 a word. So that'll be £8. And he says, how can it be £8 if Lewis is dead? It's only 4 words. And she says, well, there is a minimum charge. So he thinks a bit and he says, very well then, right, Lewis is dead. We also sell scaffolding. Some years back, when I was a bit hard up, I had to be the quiz master on the Owen Money show on Radio Wales. And the one thing they said when I started this little task was make the questions really, really simple. There was the suggestion that the Welsh aren't all that clever, right? So the first question I set was, what is the national bird of Wales? Now, unlike the United States, we don't have a national emblem, we don't have a bald eagle or whatever. But I was thinking, well, at the time, the red kite was very prominent, and that's, I think, the answer I had in mind. Anyway, so the first guy phoned up and said, is it a puffin? I said, no, the national bird of Wales is not a puffin. So the next guy phoned up thinking the first guy must have been on to something. So he said, is it a muffin? So maybe the people who thought that maybe the question should have been easier were right. So, I don't know if I should say this, right, because there's someone recording it, but because it involves naming someone, but I will name her because it's a name from the past. Do you remember Sarah Edwards on who's presenting Wales Today? Or am I so old that I can only talk about things that I remember? Anyway, I used to work with Sarah Edwards, and Sarah Edwards was famous for being really meticulous. If she was in the studio and you were out in the field, she would ask you to not only supply the questions that she was meant to ask you via the satellite link, but also the answers. So everything's really meticulous. Other than on this one occasion. So the principal news story on this day was the fact that the Rolling Stones were coming to Wales and were going to play in Cardiff. And this was a big thing, big enough for us to send the satellite dish to the stadium, and that was going to be the thing that started Wales Today and ended Wales Today, and we would go to a little section as well, somewhere in the middle of the programme, about the Rolling Stones coming to Wales. And to make it even more of a story, there was doubt over whether Keith Richards would actually turn up, because he'd broken his finger. So not only did we have the Rolling Stones coming in, but maybe the Rolling Stones without their guitarist. So first section went well, the middle section went well, and right at the end of the programme, for the first time that any of us could remember, Sarah Edwards went off the script. She decided to ad-lib and said, and on behalf of all the women fans of the Rolling Stones out there in Wales, let's hope that Keith Richards' finger gets better, and then maybe we can all have a bit of satisfaction. The world is odd. I'm just really a sort of sandwich filler in between Brian's lovely stories. So we now return to Ireland.
Without solace. The conspiring mishaps, the signs of deeper attrition, the unwillingness of the house to be a house, to be lived in, meant as a stepping stone to Jack Walsh. It had become a millstone. Every room taunted, please investigate, find my faults, tear me down, tear me down. A life forging forward had become a life of maintenance, stopgap measures, leaky bank accounts, a stasis, a fear that the rising damp was in his bones. June kissed him and troweled the kids out the door. We need to escape the dust and bad moods. So do you. Get some more done if you have to, but then come up and stay for a few days. He missed them, but had felt pure gunslinger when he went back inside, door closed, high noon. His work in that lake of dust and bad mood was a statement of intent, an act of dominance. He worked without rest to achieve his aim, to seal and hide away the unusable, unsavable fireplace. One lone wall stripped bare and resurfaced, a triumph in abating layers. Boarding, bonding, skin coat, mist coat, eggshell, acacia white. A pristine square to muzzle the savage house, let it growl away beneath. When it was done, he stared, swigging right from the bottle of Martin Fennessy's whiskey, which had been a gift given with unwanted advice on living with old houses. Jack walked the rest of the house, dauntless now, seeing possibility, breathing easy for the first time in so long. He found the storage boxes that held June's canvases, all abstract compositions. He said that he didn't understand them. She said, "I think you do." He pulled out the one he remembered most, sharp and interlocking reds and heathers. She had titled it Next. He said that it was fun angry. She liked that. Jack brought the canvas to the finished wall and laid it down. He felt the whiskey in his hot ears and fingertips. He took his time with the spirit level and drilled a cautiously centered hanging point. As he withdrew the bit, Jack saw water creep from the hole. The house wept a brindled tear, and a dirty rivulet dissected the virgin surface of the wall. The house began to scream. It wailed around him. The house suffered, and Jack became lost in its lament. He cried out in remorse. Since first crossing the threshold, he had flouted this anguished keening. In holy cities, statues cry divine blood. This house was mired in an all too earthly pain. The concealing facades on its surface were suffocating. The bricks stressed, reached, implored. Jack crashed a sledgehammer into the wall at the puncture wound. Careful paintwork and render fell from the concealed chimney breast. The house screamed on, gasping through the spreading rupture. Large fractures called to him, and he tore orphan sections of brickwork free by hand. Finally, the hearth lay open, and Jack retreated in the particulate haze. Of the bricks emerged a young man he recognized, a boy, naked and crying and coughing up lime plaster. Soft hands arid and rent, nails broken and caked, the squandered verdure of his limbs, his rattling core. Jack held close his own teenage body. Through workman's gloves, he gripped the lithe bone shoulders and remembered the mind that shook under the burden of wakeful, unclouded youth. Jack held on to the boy, and at times became the boy who was held, without solace, on the floor in the rubble. Godly things. Margaret Hartigan took it on herself to notice holy things. All worldly things are of God, and so divinity is to be found wherever you please. In the shape of her shampoo bottle, she saw the silhouette of Our Lady, not an apparition, but a beautiful providence, so that one might anoint themselves whilst washing their hair. She understood she might be alone in appreciating the godliness of used tea bags as she blessed herself while dumping the bag from her morning cup each day. That fresh breeze in off the peat bog was godly and all, but it never held her in the same reverie that small, ordinary, often mass-produced things did. The delicate spin of the cap on the fabric softener bottle, the blue stunted bookie's pen discarded on the back of a church pew, ring pulls, losing scratch cards, lost gloves. She was prone to pocketing the trinkets which sang most beautifully to her. Margaret stayed clear of the pound shops. Their chorus was too grand. Her heart ached as she passed them. Beneath her bed, Margaret kept a large box of Kinder Egg toys, a prized inheritance from her sister Maura's children, all grown now. She kept the toys disassembled, a crystalline stew of devotionals that she would run her fingertips through and marvel upon. Thumb flesh pressed to the curvature of the black hull of some shipwrecked freighter, an alloy cog from the pullback motor of a tiny car, outer circumference smooth, inner wheel toothed. The dislodged decal of two cartoon eyes returning directly her beatific wonder. Rosary beads eat your heart out. Margaret found what pleased her most was hot glue gun in her devotionals to 2x4 MDF boards. This format allowed her to rest multiple boards stacked against a wall or in a wardrobe. These stacks were to be found throughout the house, most neatly tidied away, though the spare bedroom did lose its claim to spare. To Margaret, each object had a unique and sacred vibration, and the positioning of them on these boards fostered harmonizations and hymnal resonances. Her house played to her a silent, heavenly choir. Each month, Margaret would choose one board to hang above the mantelpiece. This feature board caused a heavy consternation to settle behind her sister's brow each time she entered the room. Maura, channel hopping, would linger for an extra beat whenever she happened on hoarders, before moving on, thinking herself delicate. She peppered Margaret with little reflex hammer remarks throughout her visits. What are we going to do with this place at all, Mags? This room is smaller, Mags, it's shrinking. There you are, Mags, I thought I'd lost you. Margaret usually laughed to herself about Maura's carry-on. There's no harm in my sister, it's her way. One day, in a rare foul form, Margaret almost got angry at her. Chill out, gal. When I'm gone, you can recycle the lot. Before I'm gone even, if I have to go to the home. But while I'm here, I'll keep it. Don't you see I love it, Maura? Now, no more of this today. Put on the kettle, will you? That's how every argument is ended in Ireland, by the way. No visit from Maura today. So Margaret phoned her and smiled as she turned a small glass bottle in her hand. Oh, that Martin's a beaut. Always a suck for us lonely old dears. And the dainty bottles he finds for me in particular, God love him. The little embellishments, always different. He must secure from out foreign, I think. Her own husband died so long ago. She missed his presence, but his absence kept her company. His absence was always right there by her side, the air respectfully making space for it. How she missed his laugh and his touch. Oh, Jesus, she'd love her right. She went back to the kinder box. As Margaret went on about her day, her perception of the house around her shifted. She noticed the furniture was gone, and all the fixtures and fittings disappeared. Reaching out, she found that everything was there, where it should be, there to her touch, just not to be seen. She washed invisible dishes with invisible water from the tap that was definitely there earlier. Somewhere, her egg timer was ringing. She ate her unseen lunch standing, and then went to put the unbeholdable eggshell in the compost bucket by the back door. Outside, she was met with a giant world, and blades of grass towered above her. Too much. She turned away. A magpie's dinosaur rasp echoed behind her. She saw now that the walls of her empty house were all a white, near translucent plastic. There was moulding flash along the walls at hip height. She reached to touch the surface, and saw her hand was a bright red plastic also. Her whole body a plastic shell, like one of her sacred playthings. Margaret touched the walls, the floor, the friction of plastic on plastic, alien, unnatural. She touched her forearm and listened to her fingertips drum hollow porcelain raindrops. Well, isn't this lovely? Margaret lay back on the tiny empty floor in the tiny empty room, letting her consciousness spread to fill the small spaces, and indulged in her new red plastic body. And final story tonight is called Little Souls. Jolene O'Donnell didn't hide in a corner, but framed herself centrally on the long, busy couch that ran the length of the wall of Flanagan's, the side with the windows that looked out on the car park, and where every month or so someone would shout, "Fox lads!" and the whole clientele would reduce to a murmur and shuffle over for a gawk at the amber, stick-legged creature sniffing the rubber tyres of an Opel Corsa or what have you. Majestic, would say Muckwellied Everett Gorman or red-faced Bill Porter. Watch him saunter, Jim Leahy in whisper, a candid tear in his eye. I'll have him yet, Big Maher, he a farmhand to the Geraghties, and sore over missing chickens. Neutral ground, bites Maureen Flynn, tapping a sharp nail into Maher's shoulder. Come on away from the windows before ye capsize us, Seamus, the barman, conscious of the liquid in patrons' glasses, finding too much rest. No Fox tonight. Fecky, thought Jolene, you don't deserve him. An aurora of a buzz about the place on festival night. Jolene sat low, well below the cloud of enthusiasm, and safe from infection. She was reeling from the sudden conclusion of a thing with a thick-tongued liar. Jolene was always of the secret opinion that she had a little soul, that what her body grew, her heart never did. Shawneen, in those few nights, made her wonder, was she wrong? Was it changing? Something in her core was different. She wasn't smitten, she wasn't in love, But there she was with the fella, and the fella there with her, and the echo in her ribcage was lesser. Now though she knew that the tender skin around her small soul had merely inflated with pus or hot air, and Seaneen had since popped it and wrung the last of the discharge from it, so it was fresh and sore and restored to its juvenile dimensions. The playboy, they called Seaneen, not a looker by any stretch, but the swagger was his own, and a voice in him would melt you. Roisin Kiley and Nuala Flanagan had each separately been his long-term live-in girls, though that his carryings on with the two had often overlapped was well known. They both left him in the end, but in a manner that left each feeling discarded. Sisterly they grew in their scorn of him, and would conspire together against him, only to undermine each other to him after. And there they were, in the corner now, with icy drinks and stares. "Will you join the coven, Jolene?" Ben Fitzpatrick, standing over and spilling porter foam on Jolene's knee. "I'd squeeze in there beside you, wouldn't I? Sure, Kilphouca, aren't we all on top of each other, huh?" Ben turned away to talk to Niall Horgan, leaving the big fold of his back resting on Jolene's hip. That was enough for Jolene. She made the move to leave. Away with her now, before any more of their comments. The heavy bucket loads of opinions and judgments they were all lumbering about with, spilling just one or two in her presence as they scuffed off each other. Once she's gone, they'll spill them all out on the floor and have a good old sort through them. "Joe, hold on," said Seamus from behind the bar. "You haven't had your blessing. Have a sip. You look like it'll leaven you." She downed a small glass of Martin Fennessy's amber. Seamus saluted. "May St. Phineas guide the unsteady way home." St. Phineas can feck off for herself. "Ah, Joe," said Seamus, hurt like. Jolene moderated the stony path through the dark end of twilight. She worked the incline of the long driveway to her empty farmhouse, the farm itself long sold to the Geraghties in her grandfather's youth. And his description of his own grandfather, hiding tears, was coming back to her now. The stones played tricks with her feet all the way tonight, mischievous pebbles torquing her ankles with bolder confidence. There was a wobble to her vision too. The fresh air had hit her middle ear a slap. The worn-out fencing that lined either side of the path helped to orient her, though it blended with the grass behind, browns and greens turning greys and blues in the failing day. Blue fields of stolen birthright, and her grandfather's grandfather crying. The feeling of the drink was rising in her. What sort of brew had Martin made this year at all? Later, and she's in the dirt somewhere. It's under her unpainted fingernails, sodden knees on her jeans, and it feels good on all fours, with the smell of dead twigs lighting up her senses. "I'll find some woodland creatures, and I'll eat them raw." She bit her lower lip, tasting earth and Vaseline. "Eat the spirit animal of every gobshite in that pub, and walk in with a belly full of power. I'll own them, digesting a little bit of their souls. Seaneen the prick, a vole or something, I'll have you." A frantic time followed, with animalistic movements Jolene never thought herself capable of. On through the land without obstruction, a keenness to her senses, the lick of faint flavours in the air, her eyes snaring tiny darts of change in the underbrush. Askance, scurry, jolt, lash, clasp, nails pointed, squirming, panic, snap, elation, flaccid. A clump of skin and hair in that whistling gap between her front teeth. Jolene retching, and the remains of her innocent plaything on the ground, one dead half below her in the pool of her sick, the other flung from her to the edge of the small clearing. When the convulsions eased, Jolene looked up at the trees, twisting a helix into the stars. The sky took hold of the strings of her gaze and lifted her. Jolene's toes ached the stretched inches off the ground. With a blink, she snapped her suspension. A school of twigs broke beneath her back. A stick-legged fox appeared at the edge of the clearing and gulleted Jolene's leavings. It approached her on tender paw and licked dried blood from below her bottom lip. It sat next to her face, chewing on the rest of Jolene's offering. Jolene cried into the fox's coarse fur. Her tears fell unimpeded through its skin and dropped into an endless starscape secretly wrapped inside the vulpine shell. The fox's little soul swam the void alone, no bigger for all the broken creatures it had consumed. She woke on wet ground. Her eyes were stung by the sharpened grey sky. Pecks of rain bit at her cheeks and smashed onto her teeth. On soft breath, Jolene mouthed, "All souls are small morsels."
I'll make a prediction. If the Celtic gods are just and have any sense of fine literary judgment, in a couple of years' time, Brian Manton will be selling his books in Seaways. Tomorrow, don't forget, it's a 3-day festival, so tomorrow we have 2 films. One is a psychodrama set on the Smalls Lighthouse, directed by Chris Crowe and starring Mark Lewis-Jones. And then there's a lovely film, which has taken 2 years to make, which looks at the coast, the crinkled, crenulated, crimped coasts around here. But it's at sea anemone level. And it includes music by David Pepper, and tomorrow he'll be presenting his piano suite, Finisterre. And to round off the day tomorrow, there is some music by the late Eric Sweeney, which connects with so much of Ireland and Wales, and some music inspired by Hook Lighthouse in the south of Ireland, and those twinkling lights that connect Ireland and Wales. It's a 3-day festival. We've had a really good turnout. I think that we can actually turn David Pepper into the busiest gopher in Fishguard to try and get another festival for next year. But the main thing to do now is to thank once again Brian Manton.
Thank you all for coming out tonight and for listening. And if any of you enjoyed those stories, there's some cards at the front table by the door that has a link where you can sign up to hear about new recordings and new readings. And there's recordings of the stories tonight and a couple of others available on Nation Company as well. Thank you.